Hi, it's Pastor Jeff Elliott from Cape May Lutheran Church with this week's sermon on Matthew chapter 16. The sermon is entitled Cornerstones and Stumbling Stones. What should the leader be like in the Christian community? That was really the question that was raised when people were debating about the identity of Jesus. You remember that last week in our gospel, Jesus asked his disciples, "Who are people saying that I am?" And his disciples replied, "Well, some people are saying that you're John the Baptist, others that you're the prophet who will come at the end of days." Then Jesus asked them the more important question. Jesus asked, "And who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered that Jesus was the Christ. But for all of them, even for Peter, for all of them, there was still the understanding that Jesus was part of the old, understandable, violent order of things, no different than anyone who had come before, except in a matter of degree. Now, if you were listening last week to the sermon, you remember that we went back to Mark's original story, his telling of the story, which was cleaned up by Matthew, to make Peter look better as the head of the church. In Mark's original telling of the story, as in this story, Jesus rebukes Peter, and then he tells all of his disciples not to talk to anyone about his being the Messiah. That's different in Mark. He tells them all to be silent about his being the Messiah. Some scholars think this was because Jesus did not understand himself to be the Messiah. In fact, I think it was to prevent them from spreading their own mistaken conceptions about what a Messiah ought to be. Because Mark understood the Messiah, and I think Jesus understood the Messiah to be a suffering servant. Peter rebuked Jesus concerning this teaching. Peter didn't like this idea of the suffering servant Messiah at all. Peter often let an overabundance of testosterone do his thinking for him, and he would not allow himself to be corrected on this point, not even by Jesus. The Messiah was a warrior. The Messiah was a king. Peter knew this. He'd been taught it all of his life. The Messiah was a junkyard dog. In a man's world, this is simply what a leader had to be. Otherwise, your enemies would walk all over you. Matthew tries to explain that Peter could not stand to hear such negative thought from someone he had just proclaimed to be the Messiah. But I think that the difference in understanding is more fundamental than that. The Messiah was understood by all of the Jewish people of Jesus' day to be the biggest winner of all times. And Jesus was talking like a loser. Peter wanted a junkyard dog, and Jesus was talking like a kitten. In response to Peter's outburst, Jesus corrected Peter a second time. And in the strongest possible language, he calls him Satan. "Peter," he said, get behind me, Satan." He was not being the cornerstone of the church, the stone that Jesus had just proclaimed to be Cephas, but he was being the church's stumbling stone. In other words, Jesus was saying Peter was out of step with the way that God did things in this world. This is a watershed event in the teaching of Jesus as it's presented in the Gospels. A watershed event in the types of parables that Jesus tells in the synoptic stories. Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi is followed quickly by Jesus' transfiguration on the mountain, And from that time on, Jesus stops telling stories about the kingdom of heaven. He stops telling stories that focus on green, rapidly growing things. And Jesus begins to talk about sacrificial love. The message for us is clear. The disciple must be like the teacher. Jesus says, if anyone wants to follow me, wants to come after me, that one must deny his or herself, must take up his or her cross, and must follow me. But you know what? I think that Jesus lost this argument. I think that Peter won. The church, with its model of concentrated power in the hands of a clerical hierarchy, is still patterned on the Roman system of governance. Pastors still wear, when we're at church doing the liturgy, the tunica alba, the white robe, and the stole of the Roman senator. This is hardly the image of shared power that Jesus taught. Now, I frankly hoped, I thought, that when women became bishops in the church, this might change. I thought that women might instinctively carry their power a little more lightly, knowing how things had turned out when men were in charge. But I'm sad to report this is so far not at all the case. Not yet. Maybe with the church collapsing all around us, we're simply running scared. But Peter's thinking remains dominant. And frankly, Peter's thinking remains pure poison. The world willingly buys into this image of leadership. Our political conventions, both Republican and Democrat, show this clearly enough. But this old world is groaning in pain. Record-breaking wildfires, global pandemics, civil unrest. We have to start doing things differently for the world to survive. We have to start thinking differently. We have to start acting differently. We can begin by standing with the losers like Jesus did. We can begin by rejoicing over the last, the lost, the little, and the least. Jesus is a softer, more nurturing Messiah, one who wins by dying, who wins by giving his life away. Jesus, in the Gospels, will move on from this week to begin to tell different stories, his parables of grace. He'll move on to tell his first parable of grace, the parable of the lost sheep. And I truly believe that not until our leaders turn their attention to finding the lost ones again, to listening to those who are hurting, to standing with those who are oppressed, will our world begin to find its way again. Amen.